Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first HipFest at Home online presentation for 2023. My name is Alison Strauss, and I'm the director of the Hippodrome Silent Film Festival and the programmer of the Hippodrome year-round. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just give you a bit of housekeeping before we get properly started. Subtitles are available by clicking the CC icon in your YouTube video player. If you are joining this presentation for the online premiere on Monday, the 30th of January, and would like to ask Professor Shelley Stamp a question, you can submit that question or indeed a comment in the chat box. And Shelley has kindly agreed to watch along as this talk goes live, and she'll endeavour to respond to any messages in the chat throughout the presentation. So keep an eye on the comments. That is all the practicalities out of the way. One of the bonuses of this online programme Strand is that we get to invite contributions from very exciting guest speakers who otherwise would be out of reach for us. Speakers like our extra special guest today, Professor Shelley Stamp, a leading expert on women and early film culture. Shelley is a film historian and curator, as well as author of the award-winning books Lois Weber in Early Hollywood and Movie-Struck Girls, Women and Motion Picture Culture After the Nickelodeon, and numerous other publications. Shelley is also curator of the award-winning 6-disc set Blu-ray, Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers, founding editor of the journal Feminist Media Histories, and editor of the Feminist Media Histories book series for the University of California Press. Alongside all of that, she finds time to be a distinguished professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she has taught for almost 30 years, twice winning the Excellence in Teaching Award. Her expertise has been called upon by archives and TV networks, including the likes of iFilm Institute in the Netherlands and Turner Classic Movies in the States. So, as you will have gathered, we couldn't be in better hands for our talk on serial queens in the silent era. I'm really thrilled that Shelley was willing to be part of HipFest 2023, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over to her now, Professor Shelley Stamp.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shelley Stamp, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk with you about the serial queens today. There has been a lot of hand-wringing in the popular press in the last few years about whether or not female stars or female protagonists can anchor action-adventure films. There has been so much hand-wringing around this question, and I'm here to tell you that that debate was settled over 100 years ago by the serial queens. They were cinema's first action heroes, and they were almost all women. So this question was settled a long time ago. So when we think of a title like The Perils of Pauline, we tend to think of an embattled heroine, poor Pauline, tied to the railroad tracks with some nefarious mustache-twirling villain about to do her harm. This popular image of serials and of serials like The Perils of Pauline could not be further from the truth. This image is more truthful of what was going on in these early action-adventure films with female leads. The women rescued men more often than not. They were physical, they brawled with men, they fought with men, and they performed amazing acts of physical daring, leaping from moving cars onto moving trains, scaling tall buildings while masked and disguised, leaping from trestle bridges onto moving trains, leaping from one train to another. This generation of action-adventure heroes or heroines were absolutely extraordinary, right? And as you might imagine, these films were incredibly popular with audiences. The films and their stars, incredibly popular with audiences, with young women in particular. In fact, serials really marked the first sustained, deliberate attempt by the movie industry, the American movie industry, to cultivate and cater to female patrons on a huge national scale. So the American movie industry was very interested in cultivating female patronage in the 1910s when serials appeared, particularly white middle-class female patronage. That was the audience that they were hoping for. And the idea was that white middle-class women coming to the cinema would lend legitimacy to this new art form. So serials seemed like they might fit this bill, right? They were incredibly popular with young women. But the content of the serials, which was kind of blood-boiling action adventure, and the format of the serials, which was ongoing, multi-pronged, intertextual, both the content and the form of the serials contravened ideas about decorous femininity, right? Yes, serials cultivated a female audience for the movies, but they did so with kind of blood-boiling action-adventure films, and they cultivated a kind of ongoing, fanatical, obsessive interest in going to the movies. So serial fans clearly wanted to see action-adventure heroines on screen, and they reveled in the surrounding movie culture that enveloped these films and their stars. And I'll say lots more about that in a minute. But the culture that surrounded the serials allowed for the audiences to nurse a fascination with the stories and the stars and the heroines over a sustained period of time across multiple platforms, not just in the movies, but in newspapers, in fan magazines, and through collectible souvenirs. But this interest is cultivated by the industry. The industry is interested in female fans, but there was a kind of pathology sometimes attached to this investment that female fans had in serials and serial queens. Some feared an affliction that they called serialitis was plaguing fans, right? So desperate were fans for details about the next installment of their favorite story and the next details about the heroine that they most admired, right? So serials, on the one hand, cultivated female patronage, but did so with films that were very, very different from other films at the time. They offered ongoing narratives that at a time when the industry was moving towards feature films, and they encouraged ongoing, interactive, extra-textual modes of consumption in fan magazines and newspapers and the like, right? So serials were released in installments, as the name suggests, right? Usually once a week, sometimes twice a week. Some had storylines that continued week by week. Others had relatively self-contained adventures each week. But they were released in kind of regular installments, usually of 1 or 2 reels in length. So a 2-reel installment would be about 20 minutes. And so this serialized format really went against dominant filmmaking trends at the time. The US industry was really shifting decisively to a self-contained feature-length films at this point. So a feature-length film of this era would be about 70 minutes in length, right? And the drive towards feature films in this era was another way to assert cultural legitimacy for cinema, right? It was a way to align cinema with highbrow art forms like stage plays and novels. It was a way of attracting middle-class patrons, all of which is about establishing the legitimacy of this art form. So serials didn't do this. they were not features and they were not self-contained, right? So they're neither feature films nor traditional short films because they are continuing serialized stories. And so they were appealing to exhibitors because they could be tailored into older patterns of film exhibition where a whole series of shorts would have formed a program, right? So exhibitors could continue to do that with the serials, but they offered a kind of cumulative finished narrative that was even longer than a feature film, than a 70-minute feature film, right? So serials offered, in a way, the best of both worlds, right? Exhibitors could experiment with offering sustained stories over these multiple episodes, but do it in a way that fit in with existing patterns of programs of shorts, right? So the serials occupy a kind of really interesting niche in this moment, right? Where they are neither features nor shorts, and they're offering this kind of continuing story. And they are explicitly inviting viewers to engage with these stories across multiple platforms. This is what also separates them from other films at the time, right? So fans were encouraged to sustain their interest in the serials across multiple platforms, and newspapers were a key way of doing this. So a serial like The Adventures of Kathleen was published in conjunction with the Chicago Tribune newspaper and all of its subsidiaries. And so the Sunday supplements of the Tribune printed installments, written summaries of each weekly installment prior to its release in theaters later that week. And as you can see, also often included film stills or drawings of the action, right? So this encouraged fans it was an advertisement for the films, but also encouraged audiences to nurse their interest in these stories in multiple ways, reading it and seeing it in the movie theater, right? So another example would be The Perils of Pauline, where printed installments were published in the San Francisco Examiner newspaper. And those installments had a banner at the top that featured mirrored images. On one side, a drawing of a woman reading a newspaper in a chair, and on the other side of the banner, a drawing of a woman sitting in a movie theater in front of a screen. So clearly inviting fans, women, to both read the stories and watch them in the movie theaters. And the newspaper advertised, read it here now, then see it all in motion pictures, right? So sort of multiple platform consumption. They also often emphasized the specificity of cinema's visual appeal, right? Really drove home the particular unique sensation of watching these stories on screen, right? So the Chicago Tribune, which published The Adventures of Kathleen stories, encouraged readers to see Kathleen herself with your own eyes in every hairbreadth adventure and thrilling escape, right? It wasn't enough to just read the newspaper serials. You had to do both, right? So newspaper serializations are a key part of the multiple platforms in which serial stories emerge. Another really important element of this are fan magazine profiles of the stars. So the actresses who played these action adventure heroines, the serial queens, were incredibly popular. Pauline White, Helen Holmes, Grace Cunard, Kathleen Williams, and many, many more, right? They were the subjects of many profiles in fan magazines that detailed every aspect of their private lives, their homes, their romances, their backgrounds, their beauty routines, right? We know what fan culture does. But what's interesting here is that these were some of the very first movie stars. And in fact, serial films dovetailed neatly with the evolution of the movie star system in the US. So early fan magazines like Motion Picture and Photoplay debuted in 1911 and 1912, right before the explosion of the serials. So they're the serials are perfectly timed, right, with the beginning of fan magazines and the rise of movie fan culture. And the ongoing nature of the serial stories only enhances the investment that fans might have with not just the heroines on screen, but the actresses who played them behind the scenes. And the fact that so many of these serial queens shared names, first names, with the characters they played on screen. So Kathleen Williams plays Kathleen Hare in The Adventures of Kathleen. Helen Holmes plays Helen in The Hazards of Helen. This only encouraged fans to think about the interconnectedness of the characters they were seeing on screen and the actresses who played them behind the scenes. And I'll have more to say about the fan magazine profiles in a minute. But what I want to emphasize here is the way in which fans' engagement with this material spread way beyond the movie screen to newspapers, to fan magazines, and then also to a whole material culture of souvenir tie-ins. So you could nurse and prolong your interest in serial queens with all kinds of material culture that you could collect and keep in your home. So sheet music was published for almost all of these stars and films. One could collect playing cards that had images of these serial queens on them. You could collect pillow tops with their images so that you could sleep beside your favorite star. You could collect spoons. You could collect paper dolls. And you could clip photos of your favorite stars from fan magazines and paste them into scrapbooks. These are photographs of beautiful fan scrapbooks created for Mary Pickford, who was not a serial queen, but it gives you an example of the extraordinary kind of scrapbook art that was being done by young female fans of this era, the kind of care that was taken in clipping out these images from fan magazines, pasting them together in scrapbook pages, and pasting together images of the on-screen roles that these actresses had with images of them in their private lives, right? So another element of material culture, but kind of fan-crafted material culture, were these scrapbooks. So newspaper tie-ins represent kind of one form of extra textual engagement that the serials offered to their fans, but this extra textual engagement extends way out to fan magazines, to collectible material culture. And another really interesting facet of this are contests that many serials used to promote their products, right? So there were multiple sites of consumption for fans, most of which were located outside of movie theaters, right? Newspapers, fan magazines, collectibles, that encouraged fans to see themselves as part of a community of fans rather than as isolated spectators. And this is nowhere more true than in the case of contests. So many serials sponsored contests that asked fans to participate in the outcome of these ongoing, evolving stories released in weekly installments, right? So contests really fostered a model of interactive consumption that encouraged fans to suspend narrative desire across and between episodes, right? As they're waiting for the next installment to be serialized in their daily newspaper and then show up in their local movie theater, they can sustain their interest through these contests and, moreover, become actively involved in unfolding events by posing questions and hypotheses about their outcome, right? So this practice starts with the very first serial, What Happened to Mary. So after the first installment was published, readers were asked to submit essays speculating on the outcome of Mary's adventures, right? They were offered $100 if you can tell what happened to Mary. So this contest, utterly typical, right, encouraged women to imagine themselves in the heroine's position, saying, what do you think? You see the predicament she's in. What might happen to us in her place? So encouraging fans to think of themselves in Mary's role, but also to relish the creative control involved in storytelling, right? Fans were told, let your imagination have full play. Nothing is too extraordinary to happen to our Mary. So in this contest, female agency is stressed on two fronts, right? The on-screen agency of Mary, the character that fans are invited to identify with, and the off-screen agency of the fan creator who is writing a new adventure for Mary, right? And so this contest for What Happened to Mary, the first serial, becomes a template for many, many, many contests that almost all serials have, as a way, again, of engaging fans and sustaining their interest across the unfolding of all of these episodes. The contests and all of this other promotional culture in fan magazines and souvenirs and newspapers was incredibly effective. The serials were incredibly popular. Exhibitors reported large crowds gathered at theaters to see these films. The owner of 2 movie theaters in Baker, Oregon, said the serial Lucille Love proved to be the greatest drawing card in many moons. And the owner of the Best Theater in Hillsborough, Texas, was able to recoup a full week's expenses with one showing of a Grace Cunard, Francis Ford serial. So popular were the serials, and so urgent was the audience desire to see them, that film rental exchanges circulated unusually high volumes of prints. So, for instance, for The Adventures of Kathleen, when it was released in Chicago, rental exchanges circulated 4 times the usual number of prints than any other film previously screened there, serial or not, right? That gives you a sense of just how much demand there was for serials like The Adventures of Kathleen. 4 times the usual number of prints circulated in Chicago when it was released. Now, to give you a flavor of the popularity of these films and the behavior of audiences in theaters at screenings, let me read you testimony from the manager of the Star Theater in Deep River, Connecticut, following a screening of episode 9 of the Lucille Love serial. This is what he has to say. Lucille Love has got our patrons simply wild. I have seen many an excited crowd at moving picture shows, but this certainly was the limit. Grace Cunard has a strong hold on our patrons, and when she momentarily got the upper hand on Francis Ford in a tough and tumble fight, the crowd simply went insane. Everyone was right up on their feet, cheering and yelling. And it is a fact that throughout the last 600 feet of the second reel, I doubt if there was 25 in the whole place in their seats, right? That's an extraordinary account of the investment that fans had in these films and in the action adventure heroines that they saw on screen. They could not stay in their seats, right? Critics at the time also noted the effects that these kind of sensational films had on their viewers. So one reviewer reviewing The Adventures of Kathleen noted that one thrill succeeds another so rapidly that the spectator is out of breath mentally in trying to keep abreast of them, right? Another reviewer, Margaret MacDonald, said that the action in The Exploits of Elaine fairly makes the nerves creep, adding that fans were likely tortured by cross-cutting that both prolonged and withheld scenes of Elaine in trouble, right? So theater owners are presenting incredible eyewitness testimony of the behavior of fans in theaters, and reviewers are writing about the physiological effects on one's body of watching these nerve-wracking thrills, right? Now, despite the excitement that these films generated, despite the daring do of the heroines on screen, the plots of many of these serial films are actually quite conservative when you think about the overall arc of the stories. So initially, the independence of the heroine is often stressed right in the opening episode of the serial. So, for instance, in the opening episode of The Perils of Pauline, Pauline's beloved guardian dies, and she refuses a marriage proposal from the guardian's son, Harry, right? So her guardian dies, and she refuses to marry the guardian's son. And she tells the dying guardian, "It may be that I shall consent to marry Harry someday, but you know my adventurous spirit." And then she goes on to tell him that she wants to experience the greatest thrills so that she can write about them, her ultimate ambition being to be a writer. So this setup at the beginning of The Perils of Pauline, which with a heroine who is effectively orphaned, right? Her guardian dies and refuses marriage, is true of the setup of many other serials. Often in the opening episodes, the heroine's parents or parental-like figures are kidnapped or murdered or die, underscoring their independence, right? Foisting them out into the world, right? Underscoring the fact that they don't live within traditional family structures, right? And this is all the more true of Pauline because not only that, she refuses marriage. Same thing in What Happened to Mary. Mary Dangerfield, the heroine of that serial, also explicitly refuses marriage at the outset of her adventures. As one reviewer at the time explained, Mary has become a dreamer and is in no mind to marry. So the serial set out seeming to really establish the independence of their heroines, the way that they live outside of marriage and outside of traditional family structures. But two things tend to happen over the arc of the serials. First, despite all of their apparent independence, heroines often find themselves embroiled in really complicated plots of inheritance and family lineage that make them not so independent of their families after all, right? Hidden ties are revealed, right? And it's really an illusion that they are living free of a family structure. So that's one thing that happens. Second thing that happens is the heroines tend to get married at the end of the serial, right? Heroines like Pauline and Mary explicitly refuse marriage in the opening episode, but usually come round to marriage at the end. So Pauline, who has refused Harry, returns safely to his arms, usually at the end of every episode. And then by the end of the serial overall, they are married, right? And their marriage signals the end of the story. So in the concluding episode of The Perils of Pauline, Pauline tells Harry, "I have once and forever finished with this life of adventure. I'm quite prepared to marry you, Harry, and we shall be happy at last." Right? So, as in so many Hollywood feature films, heterosexual marriage signifies closure, signifies the end of the story, and it does so in these serial films as well. So, while the serial queens appear to live beyond the strictures of traditional family life, appear to refuse marriage, in the end, their exploits are often heavily circumscribed by the parameters of family life. And in the end, they often do marry, right? So the plots of the serials are a little more conservative than they might at first appear to be, right? But here's where it's interesting to look back then at the fan magazines and look at the extended stories that serial fans are consuming about the serial queens beyond what they're seeing on screen. Here's where fan magazines get really interesting. So, for instance, there's a way in which fans can measure the exploits of their favorite on-screen characters against the real lives of the motion picture players. And this happens in many different ways. First of all, fans were told that the stars themselves had a real life taste for adventure. So even after the cameras are turned off, fans were told actresses pursued high octane adventures. So Pearl White told an interviewer, "For recreation, I like beefsteak and aviation." Grace Cunard was described as the perfect devotee of motoring, for whom no speed was great enough, right? They liked fast cars, they liked airplanes, they liked meat, right? So the women's accomplishments, in other words, were not simply skills honed for motion picture cameras or faked on screen, but deep-seated character traits. And this helps complicate the relatively conservative plots that people were seeing on screen, right? Moreover, the professionalism of these working women and the athletic prowess and daring that they displayed on set was repeatedly emphasized to fans in fan culture. So fans were repeatedly told that these women performed their own stunts, that tremendous skill and stamina was required to execute the maneuvers that they saw on screen, and that many stars braved incalculable dangers while filming. So if the on-screen plots seem to register ambivalence about women's independence, as I just stressed, right, this surrounding fan culture does exactly the opposite, right? It's emphasizing professionalism and skill and daring. So a profile of Pearl White in American Magazine declared, "All over the world, her name has become a synonym for courage and daring. To her, leaps over cliffs and dives off decks of ocean liners are as prosaic and uneventful as her morning grapefruit." Right? Kathleen Williams was described as the nerviest movie lady in the land. And this kind of athleticism and professionalism really resonated with fans. So one fan wrote into Photoplay Journal, Helen Tarbox was the fan's name, confessing, "Most of all, Pearl White's daredevil acting is what I admire." So behind the scenes details proved that real women, the actresses, not just fictional heroines, could manifest strength and prowess displayed in the fanciful adventure stories on screen. And what is more, the serial queens urged other young women interested in entering the movie business to focus less on beauty, which was usually what was emphasized to prospective female starlets, and much more on practical skills. So Pearl White, for instance, urged young women interested in the film business to be strong, to learn hobbies, to be fearless, and to keep physically fit, right? Traits such as these, she insisted, would boost a young woman's chances in the motion picture industry much more readily than painstaking beauty treatments or fancy skin creams, right? So the professionalism of these stars was stressed in a lot of fan magazine profiles, and their athleticism and daring was stressed. Another thing that was stressed is the creative control that they exercised on their projects. So Helen Holmes, for instance, took over much of the production of the Hazards of Helen serial in early 1915 when the director, J.P. McGowan, was hospitalized. So she wrote scripts and she directed several episodes. And Holmes said, "If I want really thrilly action, I ask permission to write it myself," explaining, "Men usually won't provide for a girl things to do that they wouldn't do themselves," right? If I want thrilly action, I have to write it myself. She's absolutely right, right? So Holmes was not alone. Holmes wrote and directed many episodes of Hazards of Helen. Grace Cunard directed episodes of several of her serials, including Purple Mask. When Kathleen Williams wrote and directed episodes of The Adventures of Kathleen, ads emphasized that the episodes had been written, directed, and acted by Kathleen herself, as if the screen heroine, Kathleen Hare, back from Fighting Lions, had made her own motion picture, right? So here there's a kind of conflation of actress and character works in really interesting ways. Now, another aspect of fan magazine profiles, of course, beyond these details about their professional lives, the on set and the creative control that they exercised by writing and directing these episodes, were details about the stars' private lives, about their marriages and their families and their homes. Very typical of fan culture, of course, even back in these early days. You might expect that profiles of the private lives would counteract these on-screen stories of heroism and danger by framing the stars in their real lives as, more typically domesticated women, right, as performing more typically feminine roles at home. But this was not the case, right? Fan culture showed actresses embracing new feminine roles in their private lives and at home, eking out egalitarian relationships with men, integrating motherhood into work, and redefining the home front. So details that emerge in fan magazine write-ups played a key role in suggesting ways that the hyperbolic feminism of screen heroines might be extended into more prosaic, if not less revolutionary goals, right? Though less spectacular than leaping onto a speeding locomotive, small domestic revolutions in the lives of these film personalities really help sketch the contours of modern femininity for serial fans. So let me give you some examples of what they are doing and saying. So Pearl White told one interviewer, frankly, I'm not domestic. Kathleen Williams said she preferred baseball, fencing, and motoring to housework. White, who remained single throughout the peak years of her serial stardom, openly advocated a new model of companionate relationships between men and women. That is, relationships based on mutual respect and companionability, right? And equality. When members of the New York State Federation of Women's Clubs disagreed, claiming that movies and by implication stars like White were exerting a degenerating influence on young women by encouraging them to be pals with men, White publicly disagreed. Right? And so if stars like White and Kathleen Williams openly refused conventional feminine norms around domesticity and heterosexual marriage, profiles of other serial stars emphasized their off-screen lives as wives and mothers in ways that provided a really interesting counterbalance to the resolutely single, childless women they played on screen, right? Although marriage signified the end of so many on-screen heroines' adventures, this wasn't the case for the actresses, right? If their on-screen characters stopped having adventures when they got married, married actresses showed that marriage and work could continue simultaneously, right? So fan magazines attentive to stars' love lives demonstrated how marriage and child rearing did not interfere with the women's professional careers, right? A really important message. So when Helen Holmes of The Hazards of Helen adopted an infant daughter, there was really interesting coverage of their relationship and her new role as a mother, right? And there were opportunities to feature her in intimate circumstances not normally associated with the fictional Helen she played on screen, right? But also to demonstrate how Holmes broke new ground in her maternal role, right? So they were pictured together in overalls. You can see them here. And Helen holding young Dot aloft on a train. And Helen said she will be dressed in a pair of overalls and play with a monkey wrench. And in time, you'll see her tied to a driving rod while the locomotive speeds on its way, as if young Dot embodied the promise of womanhood that Helen on screen and Holmes herself only pointed towards, right? So my point is that attention to stars' private lives explicitly countered on-screen serial plots that all too frequently offered marriage as the conclusion of a heroine's adventures, right? So it's likely that these fan magazine profiles really served a substantial function in reconciling conventional spheres of femininity like marriage and motherhood with much more updated incarnations of womanly strength and autonomy that the stars embodied on screen, thus furnishing crucial roadmaps for female fans who might be trying to reconfigure their own lives beyond the customary structures of marriage and family life. So office workers, retail clerks, factory laborers, the likely fan base for serials, probably looked to the serial queens' off-screen lives for fresh ideas about womanhood that they could emulate in small but meaningful ways in their own lives. So the impact of the serial queens is really profound and important. It allows us to see how novel these on-screen roles were for women at the time, but also how fan culture and the material culture of serials and collecting allowed fans to really think about what was to really rethink female roles on and off screen. It's been a real pleasure being able to talk to you about the serial queens. I hope you enjoy the films that you are going to see at HipFest, and you are in for a treat. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Shelley Stamp, and thank you all for joining us. If you want to read more about serial queens and women film pioneers, do consider supporting your local bookshop, or indeed the bonus bookseller, Inkspot and Silverleaf, where you can pick up or order Shelley's books. This presentation will remain available online, and you can watch again at your leisure and tell your friends to do the same. Our next online talk will be released in February, when we will hear from the esteemed author, translator, and biographer Christine Latour, who will share with us insights into the brilliant career of the French film director and screenwriter Maurice Tourneur. See you soon.